Good evening, everyone. I'm not Norman Crowley. I believe Norman's name is in the panel, and Norman couldn't make it this evening, so I'm here to replace Norman. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Joe, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to share the panel with these wonderful speakers. I'm sure you all agree that it's been a tremendous insight into the biodiversity crisis and, of course, the rich resources that we have here in Ireland to actually address that crisis. I'm going to start this evening by telling you a little bit about my child. I have a child who's a bad sleeper, and he likes to fall asleep in my arms, not in my cot. And I'm sure some of you may know what sleep deprivation is like. It's a horrible thing. But sitting with your child asleep in your arms, and he only sleeps on this side, he doesn't like to sleep on that side for some reason. But when you're sitting with your child asleep in your arms around 1 o'clock in the morning, sitting in a dark corner of the room, it actually provides some non-distracted quality time to contemplate your child's future. The panel abstract invites us to have a think about the 21st century and the challenges that lie ahead. And I spent so much of my time reading and writing about what we can expect from the 21st century in terms of climate change, in terms of the biodiversity crisis, and in terms of how we respond. And inevitably, it leads any parent, any adult, to ask some serious questions about what my child's life, what our children's lives will be like over the coming decades. Over the course of his life, I ask, will we fail to turn the ship around? Will we continue on a pathway of global warming of between 3 and 4 degrees before 2100? Unfolding the most catastrophic impacts of climate change? Will we see the 1.5 degree of global warming before 2050 if we allow the current pace of increase to continue? My child will be around 30 in 2050. At 2050, how will some of the most vulnerable regions of the world already experiencing the impacts of climate breakdown be affected? What will the geography of this world look like? I found it really interesting driving here today. I came up from Wicklow, and driving down towards the coast, I had turf cutters on one side, I had the siccus spruce on the other, there was a lot of rhododendron as well, and then I had these wind turbines on the horizon. And I thought, wow, isn't this fascinating? This is kind of a carbon landscape. This is almost a climate landscape. But what will my child's landscape look like? What will the politics of his world look like? What will the hardships and the suffering of his world look like? Not just in terms of extreme weather, but also in terms of actual life on Earth. And over his lifetime, will we continue on the pathway which Yvonne laid out before us, where over 1 million animal and plant species face extinction, where land and water continues to be degraded, as Iski reminded us, at an alarming rate, propelling us beyond the safety net of our planetary boundaries? These questions are as relevant to us here in Ireland as they are to the global community. And over the coming decades, will Ireland continue to lag behind on trying to meet not just its climate obligations, but also its nature laws? As my son enters his teens, will we continue to see rising emissions from the transport, the energy, the agri-food sector, underpinned by a usual approach to how we deal with environmental problems? More of the same, while we eat into what is a quickly diminishing carbon budget, paying our way out of our failure to comply with our environmental obligations. What will my son's landscape look like? Will the worsening impacts of climate change here in Ireland, sea level rise, more intense storm activity, water shortages, coastal and river flooding, undermine the potential for a healthy, stable and sustainable Irish society? And I believe that Professor John Sweeney gave a good overview of how climate will impact us here in Ireland this morning. Will he see and experience the predicted and wide-ranging impacts on our natural ecosystems, on our water resources, on our coastal regions, on food security and human health? Will he get to enjoy the same wonders that I enjoyed growing up in the countryside? I grew up on a farm in the Wicklow Mountains. The birds, the insects, the wildflowers, the exuberance of life? Or will the Irish countryside continue to become increasingly silent and devoid of the diversity of life? And I say life with a capital L. And what about our internationally important habitats, our ancient woodlands? Over the course of my son's lifetime, will we lose our raised bogs, of which just less than 1% remains? And what about creatures like the curlew or the corncrake, the lapwing, our species-rich grasslands? Will these words disappear from the vocabulary of my son's world? Or perhaps my question should be a little bit more optimistic. As my son prepares for preschool, maybe the government will have taken common sense steps and have stopped issuing licences for the continued exploration and extraction of oil and gas off our coast. And as part of that, decided not just to protect our climate, but also to protect our marine-rich ecosystems, as Easkey quite clearly laid out before us. As he prepares for post-primary, maybe Ireland will be part of a real effort to align with other countries under the Paris Agreement. Maybe we will have implemented the Sustainable Development Goals before 2030 and taken urgent and significant action to reduce the degradation of our natural habitats and halted the incredible loss of biodiversity. Maybe by then we'll have reconciled our fractured relationship with the land, with our soil, with our atmosphere, with our water, have an undertaking a rapid and transformative transition to a healthier, more sustainable Ireland. That's now demanded by science, that's demanded by the scale and urgency of the challenge, and that is increasingly demanded by our youth. So it's quite a heavy load having all of this swirl around in your head at 1 a.m. in the morning while you're trying to get your child to sleep. But the issue is that if we look at the evidence that currently stands and that has been laid out before us this evening, the answers to these troubling questions do not ignite hope for a restful sleep. We're gambling with the future. What's clear is that knowing what we know at this point in history, that through the choices that we make as politicians, as policymakers, as citizens, we are gambling with the future of our children, gambling with the stability of the Earth system. Climate change and biodiversity loss are happening at an alarming rate. It's been said a number of times already here this evening. They're interconnected, and urgent action is required to address both. I find this a fascinating time to live in. If you really think about it, we are the first generation to really begin to understand how wondrous and complex our natural world around us is. We're incredibly privileged to be where we are right now, to see a caterpillar and understand the process where a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, for example. And yet, we're the first to grasp the reality of our harmful impacts, and we may be the last with the chance to prevent much of the damage. Have a think about that. It's a heavy load to bear. And yet, when you look at how we respond to the challenges here in Ireland, it's hard to get any sense of the acknowledgement of the sheer scale and urgency that we're faced with as we navigate our way into the 21st century. Of course, in recent years, some of our politicians have acknowledged that Ireland needs to do more, certainly on the climate front, but perhaps less so when it comes to tackling biodiversity loss, or, as I like to call it, the death of nature. What should more look like? And particularly as the panel abstract says in your booklet, how can more be addressed in unison with other, not separate but interconnected challenges, such as the urgent need to protect nature? There's not a single peer-reviewed scenario on how to keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees that does not incorporate the need to work with and enhance our ecosystems. But a core failure of government policy to date, certainly on tackling climate change, has been the inability to fully integrate nature-based solutions, so working with nature. And as Padraig reminded us, nature-based solutions offer an effective and inexpensive way and a popular way of addressing the climate challenge. Think of how we deal with flooding in this country. It seems that we're so often blinded by a technocratic approach that sees nature as a problem that sees nature as something that needs to be removed and dredged and built upon, rather than seeing nature as the solution to a lot of our flooding problems. And this is despite evidence from other countries that living with flood risk, making room for the river and its natural floodplains is now best practice. And we need to be having this type of a conversation as the impacts of climate change become more apparent on our communities and on our landscapes. This is the type of conversation that we need to be having. How do we work with nature to protect against flooding and to live with flood risk? We are killing our rivers, rivers that are integral to our natural and our cultural heritage. And has been mentioned a few times here this evening, one positive move did take place in May earlier this year, where the Dáil voted to declare a climate and a biodiversity emergency, and they committed to establishing a Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss. And this followed the publication of a very important piece of work carried out by the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Change. And they were set up and they built on the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly from 2017. And in their report, the committee highlighted that working with nature, so we like to call it nature-based solutions, so working with nature can both help stop or mitigate climate change and actually help create resilience in the face of our climate impacts. This reflects the science, which tells us that working with nature can provide up to 37% of emissions reductions needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which we ratified a number of years ago. But just last month, the government's new climate action plan was published. I'm sure you heard a lot of it for those of you that were here this morning. And Minister Bruton promised that the plan would lead to a revolution in how we live. As a coalition group, we carried out an assessment of the plan, and we found that bringing about this revolution will not involve nature. And in fact, aspects of the plan we believe will actually be harmful to our nature here in Ireland. I want to take two examples just to back that up. I want to talk about peatlands, or bogs. And again, it has been mentioned a number of times here this evening. Our peatlands, our bogs, are a perfect example of a rich biodiversity habitat unique to this part of the world. They're biodiversity havens. They absorb, they store carbon. You've heard this already. They're the largest store of carbon in the Irish landscape. They prevent flooding. They help us adapt to climate change. They're a natural ally in the fight against climate change. Yet, we still use peat to generate electricity. We still use peat for fuel. We still use peat for horticulture. We still use peat for farming purposes. And currently, only 1% of our peatlands in Ireland are under rehabilitation or restoration. We're now at the point where our peat extraction, and when I talk about peat extraction, I'm talking about large-scale industrial peat extraction. And drainage is now a major source of our emissions. Peat is actually more damaging than coal to our atmosphere. And yet, it actually produces less energy. We're at the point where we realise that rehabilitation of our bogs could make many of our bogs carbon neutral or even carbon sinks, in addition to providing huge biodiversity value. And in 2017, our Citizens' Assembly identified the restoration of our bogs as a priority recommendation. Building on this, the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action recommended a target of net sequestration by 2050. They also recommended scientifically informed interim targets for restoration and a national programme of rewetting and restoring our degraded peatlands to be included in Budget 2020. They also recommended that we reward our landowners for restoring bogs and that we explore the job opportunities that could arise from restoring our peatlands as part of the idea of a just transition. I'm sure you heard the phrase used a lot in the news yesterday, for regions affected by the shift to a low-carbon economy. And yet, disappointingly, this level of ambition when it comes to looking at our peatlands, using our peatlands in the fight against climate change, and restoring our peatlands for biodiversity, the same level of ambition has not been carried forward in the government's recent climate action plan. Yes, there are considerations and references, but the state has been considerably slow to wake up to the fact that we need to get off peat as soon as possible. In fact, what we've seen instead is an exemption of industrial peat extraction from requiring planning permission. This will have implications for the rights of citizens to challenge such planning permission processes. We've also seen a move to continue using peat into the next decade, along with importing biomass from very far-off places. In other words, what we plan to do is displace the negative environmental costs to elsewhere. I'm sure some of you would have saw the announcement yesterday by On Board Pleanála regarding a planning permission to redevelop a site along the Shannon, the West Offaly Power Station, to burn peat and biomass. And On Board Pleanála stopped that planning permission. And clearly what yesterday's announcement showed is that we need to develop a plan for the workers in these regions who will be affected by the transition to a low-carbon economy. But yet the state has also been very slow to establishing a comprehensive process and plan for the men and for the women who live in these regions and who will be affected. Already we're seeing job losses. I think what it clearly shows is that this isn't just about biodiversity, this isn't just about climate, this is also about society. I'm conscious of time. The other example that I wanted to look at was monoculture, monoculture forestry, as a case of climate mitigation gone wrong. I grew up in the Wicklow uplands. My father farmed in the evenings and during the weekends, and during the week, alongside many other men from the village, he planted and felled sitka spruce for quilcha. Now that work is done by contractors and heavy machinery. We know that healthy forests are crucial in our efforts to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement, because when untouched, they store carbon. But yet here in Ireland, forestry is seen as part of a solution to bringing down emissions, although currently our forests are a source of emissions because of how they're managed. Our plan is to ramp up industrial-scale plantation, the expansion of non-native monocultures, and again this has been mentioned a few times this evening, with the hope that this will allow us to offset rising emissions from the agri-food sector. Is it realistic that we can continue with business as usual in one sector during the time of a climate and biodiversity emergency, while offset emissions with large-scale plantations of non-native sitka spruce in what is regarded as the non-productive parts of Ireland? Is that really realistic? And yet the Climate Action Plan, recently published, commits to planting an average of 8,000 hectares per annum. At what cost? This model is a key driver of significant biodiversity and water pollution, and if you live in a heavily forested region like I do, you realise that there is very little social amenity or recreational value. So there's a policy conflict here. Forestry and soils are regarded by the government as viable land use options for reducing our emissions and storing our emissions. Wetlands and peatlands are not. And this is likely explained by the fact that our peatlands are still being used for industrial scale extraction, which in the age of a biodiversity and climate emergency is unjustifiable. Why aren't we looking at the major resources, and I'm conscious that we use the word resources in the title of this panel discussion, why aren't we looking at the major resources that we already have available that, if enhanced, can store and absorb carbon? Our hedgerows, our ancient woodlands, our native woodlands, our organic soils, our peatlands, increasing native woodland cover. Or dare I say it, why aren't we having a good conversation about reversing policies in our agricultural sector which aim to push intensity on Irish farms and in doing so risk soil, biodiversity and water quality? Just to sum up, in the case of climate change, the science and the predictions are clear. The social, environmental and economic costs for the 21st century will be great. So how should we do this? Ensuring the strength of nature is central to keeping to a 1.5 degree world. Putting nature at the heart of how we tackle climate change provides us with an opportunity for renewal. Working with nature, it needs to be on the top of the policy agenda in our approach to climate change, within agriculture, within land use planning, within forestry, energy, within flood risk management. We need to ensure that the Earth system continues to provide us with the services which Yvonne outlined that we all take for granted, that we all depend on. But to get it right, climate change and the death of nature must be seen as a symptom of a much larger disconnect between society and nature. And there is a danger that in how we respond to climate change, if we don't go deeper in terms of understanding our relationship with nature and with each other, we may actually just suffice in reinforcing the problem which has contributed to rising greenhouse gas emissions and to the destruction of our environment in the first instance. The economy is not going to solve this. The market is not going to solve this. We can't realistically solve the climate challenge, the biodiversity challenge, if we continue to ignore the underlying social, economic and political factors that justify nature to vested economic and political interests. We will not solve climate change if we continue to put vested interests outside and above not just important things such as social equality and social justice, but also above the rights of nature and the place of nature in ensuring the long-term sustainability of our society. The challenges we face are non-negotiable, and there is an imperative on the state to protect us and to protect our natural environment. This requires coherent policies to be implemented without delay, and we've heard excellent examples of these already. We all have a role to play, but some of us have a greater role than others. Our efforts in our communities are pointless if our government fails to support and implement our nature laws. Our efforts are pointless if our government continues to pursue policies that result in more environmental degradation. Our efforts are futile if the democratic process itself is challenged, when debate is blocked, political instruments misused, and if citizens have to bring the state to court to ensure that our environment and with it our future is protected. Thinking beyond the cycle of politics and economic interest groups is needed. And I think above all, I'm going to skip because I'm very conscious of time. I think it's time to realise that perhaps many of the institutional ways of how we see and compartmentalise the world are actually inadequate to conceptualise the problems that we're facing, and perhaps they're incapable of imagining the type of solutions that we need to come up with, especially when it comes to working with nature. And what's clear is that as we navigate our way through the 21st century, space will need to be opened up and facilitated between communities, between non-state actors and policymakers. And a good place to start is with the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss. But most importantly, we must also give attention to the rights of distant others and future generations who have been largely excluded from the debates about sustainability here in Ireland. And we must give attention to the rights of nature and the rights of the millions of other species that we share this planet with. So, to bring it back to my child and to wrap up, the type of Ireland that I wish for, of course, is a healthy and sustainable Ireland. Yes, we will have to learn to live with change. Yes, we will have to learn to let go. And yes, we will have to learn to live with uncertainty. But it should be a place where we nurture fairness and inclusivity, and where we nurture social learning in how we respond to the environmental challenges we face. It's a place where we live up to our climate responsibilities, where we work to preserve and enhance nature. And now I'm sure my child would sleep even better knowing that this was his future.